And we're back. Welcome back to History 120 for our second lecture on American reform movements in the early 19th century. What I want to talk a little bit about today is temperance. Temperance, as I mentioned, is the push for the banning of alcohol and sometimes tobacco as a means for um, perfecting society. And when we talk about tobacco, this is not the 20th century and 21st century push to end the use of tobacco in order to save one's life or to take care of one's health. The tobacco is seen as a lazy moral choice, and a smoker is a bad person in some religious circles. By and large, alcohol is seen as the much more dangerous issue. People can physically see alcohol damaging your life and your health. So the temperance movement is essentially an attempt to perfect society by the removal of alcohol. Alcohol is literally seen not as a symptom, but as a cause of all the worldly problems that people face. If there is one answer to life, if there is one way to perfect and change life, it is banning alcohol. And people get militant on this question. We have another example here. In the last lecture, I showed the drunkard's progress. This is another illustration from a temperance publication showing the dangers of alcohol. We have, notice it's always the man that is drunk. The man in the 19th century world goes out into the world. We have separate spheres that develop for men and women. Women stay home. They are moral models for the home. They teach children. They are responsible for the moral instruction of children and making sure that the household is clean and perfect. And it is a sanctification of women that is embodied in this separate sphere. Men go out in the world and are corrupted. Men have to deal with money. Men have to deal with jobs. They are not perfect beings. And unfortunately, imperfect beings very often interact with items that make their lives worse and more corrupt. And alcohol is seen by and large as a symptom of this corrupted world. The man goes out into the world and he gets drunk. He gets drunk for any number of reasons. But when he gets drunk, he spends his money and his family has hunger. When he gets drunk, he makes poor decisions. He's disheveled. He's not a clean individual. If we look at our drunkard in this image, you can tell almost immediately by looking at him, he's in impaired health. His clothes are asunder. He doesn't look like he's got anything together as a decent human being, except for the women in his life. And we notice the women off to the left of the image are removing alcohol, it appears, and attempting to change and clean things up. The man is the cause of the corruption in this household. And so if we remove alcohol from this man's life, then obviously everything gets better. We don't realize that alcohol can be a symptom of other issues. And so if we remove alcohol, we will perfect society. But the other message that we get with temperance movements is that if we remove alcohol, we'll perfect questionable people, not just the corrupted man. We will force upon people the ability to live a middle class, early Victorian era lifestyle that is the only truly acceptable means. We don't take into account the social functions of alcohol for European immigrants, except for the fact that we see those immigrants as inferior. This is especially true if we look at the Irish and depictions of the Irish in the 19th century. The Irish immigrant after about the late 1830s and especially the 1840s and the potato famine are depicted as nearly inhuman. They are thuggish, they are brutes, they are uneducated, and they're always drunk. And if we want to force these people to change, all we have to do is ban alcohol. If we want to end spousal abuse, all we have to do is ban alcohol. If we ban alcohol, workers will have enough money to feed their families. We don't take into account that there are social aspects of alcohol at play beyond just college level party drinking. If you're a German immigrant, the beer hall is a very important, pardon me, I thought I had a slide of a beer hall. If you're a German immigrant, the beer hall is a social aspect of life that maintains a connection with prior modes of living. It's where you go on your lunch hour, because beer halls are kind of like taverns in small towns. If you go to a tavern in a small town today, yes, you can obviously have alcohol, but they serve lunch. It's where your friends gather. And that's very much the model of the German beer hall. It's not so much going there to get hammered. You go to the beer hall at lunch and after work to get a hot meal, to read the newspaper, to interact with your friends, and in some cases to cash your paycheck, maybe to get a loan, to deal with all sorts of social interaction with other people. And the temperance movement doesn't take that into account. They see alcohol as pure evil incarnate. And one of the things we'll start getting in this period because of reform movements are states and communities on an individual basis banning the sale of alcohol. In 1851, Maine will become the first state in the United States to completely ban the sale of alcohol because of the influence of social reformers and the temperance movement. It's the first dry state. And because of that, for a long time, and even today in some circles, laws banning the sale of alcohol are called Maine laws. We also have the rise of blue laws in this period that ban certain activities on a Sunday. And the most prominent of these blue laws are banning the sale of alcohol on Sundays, either entirely or for set periods of time. There are still active blue laws with their roots in the 19th century that are around us today. There are some communities that use blue laws to ban commercial activity on Sundays. Blue laws are why you can't buy a car on Sundays in Iowa or South Dakota. Blue laws ban the sale of alcohol until noon. Actually, the last community that I lived in, Macomb, Illinois, prior to coming out to give instruction to the masses here in South Dakota, banned the sale of alcohol on Sundays. And they just, within the last month, changed their laws to allow the sale of alcohol after noon on Sundays. They still have blue laws in effect. So this is a wide-ranging movement that has its start in the 19th century and is going to continue on into the 20th century, and there are still temperance societies today working for the ban of alcohol. Prison reform comes of age, or is actually created in the early 19th century, and what this does is changes the focus of imprisonment. Prior to the early 19th century, prison was entirely about punishment. And I know some of us are saying, well, of course, prison is meant to punish a person for their crimes. But some people are concerned that there's no aspect of preventing future crime from happening. Under previous theoretical constructs of prison and imprisonment, everybody's thrown together. Murderers, pickpockets, kidnappers, the mentally ill are all thrown into the same cell in the same institution because all of these people need to be punished. Men and women are housed together in these cells. It doesn't matter what happened or who you are a criminal, so you must be punished. And that's the backbone of the prior systems of imprisonment. And what we see starting in the 1820s is the rise of a concept of reforming the individual in order to take away the impetus to commit crimes at the same time that they are punished. One of the most famous examples of this is the Auburn Plan. The Auburn Plan is a series of institutional reforms for prisons first put into practice in Auburn, New York. What is the Auburn Plan? The Auburn Plan is a highly regimented life for inmates based on labor. You go out and you do work during the day. That work could be building buildings within the prison, doing the laundry, doing tasks to make goods for sale, making license. This is the making license plates of the 19th century. You're going to wear uniforms. You're going to be stripped of your individuality and wear the striped uniform of prison stereotypes. But at its core are two other major changes. You live in complete and total silence 24 hours a day. You are not allowed to talk because this forces the individual to contemplate their crimes and seek change in their lives to make sure they don't do this crime again. You're also separated into solitary confinement. You're not going to be crowded into cells with 5 or 10 or 15 other people. You're going to live by yourself in a silent stone cell with a bed and a chair and a chamber pot. Because this, again, is going to take away any social aspects of the prison experience and force you to contemplate how to be a better person. This essentially is a form of civil monasticism for criminals. We're also going to see the rise of mental asylums at this time as part of the prison reform movement. Dorothea Dix is a female social reformer in this period who goes into these prisons and notices that a number of these inmates in prisons actually are suffering from mental illness. They're not being treated, they're being punished. And so Dorothea Dix will begin the process of reforming care for the mentally ill, not necessarily by instituting psychological therapy or deep medical care for these individuals. She's going to concentrate on separating them into mental asylums where they're not necessarily punished as criminals, but they're aggregated as the mentally ill, where reform-minded people have the opportunity to reach out and treat and care for these individuals. Sorry, I did have the alcohol. I guess I was a little out of order on these slides. I apologize for that. Usually I do a better job for editing. This is a scene of one of these 19th century beer halls. And yes, we have scenes of crime and violence and corruption here, but we have little kids drinking. We even have women drinking on some level. But we also have the social aspect of the beer hall represented here, of the arts being present, music, food. This is the inclusive aspect of alcohol in our society. We also have to realize that German beer is not something you drink to get hammered in the 19th century. This is a social drink of lower alcohol, local alcohol content. And it's also, we need to forget we tend to forget the most common beverages in the 19th century are hard cider and whiskey, because they allow us to store corn and apples for longer periods of time with greater value. But we don't have a germ theory in the 19th century. It is literally healthier to drink beer and hard cider and coffee and tea than it is to drink water. Even though water is clear, so we don't see any imperfections in it, it still carries germs and viruses that are spreading diseases throughout society. All right, let's hop back on the reform horse and get back into order. Educational reform, the change and perfection of education, has its roots in the early 19th century. Prior to the 1820s, education is very often only for the elite. That stereotype of the one-room schoolhouse, where everybody has their opportunity to have an education, a rudimentary knowledge to get through life, really only happens after the reform movement. Prior to this, the only people who had access to education were the wealthy, because they were the only ones who could hire private tutors to teach them. There are also no standards for curriculum about what is going to be taught or how it's going to be taught in classrooms. As the Industrial Revolution progresses, we see a demand for education for the children of the working class in order to not only give them a better lifestyle, but also to give them a better opportunity to be workers in these new factories. They need mathematical skills. They need to be able to read instructions. And if there's no standard educational system, there's no standard way for these children to receive the educations that they need. Horace Mann of Massachusetts is going to be the major famous individual responsible for the adaptation of educational reforms in this country. He is going to push for the establishment of a board of education or a state department of education. And what these departments or boards of education are going to be required to do is to establish a standardized level of what educational needs are for the state and make sure that every school in the state is meeting these standards. We're also going to see this movement push for a standardized form of training teachers. If you notice, colleges in the 19th century very often have the term normal school in their title. Normal school is a training school for teachers. Even if you attend normal school only for 6 months, it gives you the knowledge, the rudimentary knowledge required to teach students and pass this knowledge along to them. It's very rudimentary in the 19th century. Anybody with a high school education can essentially go out and be a teacher because you know more than the kids that you're teaching. But normal school gives you some grounding in how to run a classroom, what pedagogy is, and how to be a teacher. And this means that we are professionalizing teachers. We are valuing their labor and we want to train them. This is especially going to be important in the North, since the North is home to more industry and people who seem to value education more. Education in northern states above the Ohio River is going to be seen as more intrinsically worthwhile. In the South, where there are fewer communities, where uh, there is less industry and more reliance on farming, and not even necessarily scientific farming or looking for better agricultural practices, but farming just the exact same way that your father farmed and his father farmed, and learning as an apprentice farmer from your parents. There's not an impetus or importance placed on education. And because of that, we're not going to see real educational reform take place in the South until after the Civil War. We also need to understand that despite this picture of an all-girls school during the period, girls are going to have limited educational opportunities. Schools are not automatically going to be co-educational. Women only need to have as much education as they can acquire to sign their names and do the arithmetic necessary to maintain the household, to cook and shop and take care of their children. There's also not really going to be access to higher education for girls, such as high schools and, God forbid, colleges. If you see accounts of women going to school beyond a rudimentary elementary education, these are women of higher class status who have the financial backing of rich families, and they need this education to effect certain lifestyles expected of them because of their social class. All right, I mentioned earlier that women are separated into different spheres in the 19th century because of social ideology. These are representations of what the perfect Victorian woman's middle class life should be. The image on the right is from the 1850s. We see the woman as keeper of the home. The house is immaculate and dusted and well kept. The doors are open, air is circulating. We don't see filth and garbage laying around. The children are well fed and well clothed. We we don't have any doubts but that this woman keeps the perfect household. The man is the head of this household, but the woman runs it. Her children are worshipful and obedient of their father because of the teachings of the woman. The man goes out in the world. If you notice, the man is coming into the house in this image. He is returning from the corrupt outside world to his immaculate, perfect home, which is a shelter against that exterior corruption. If we look at the image on the left, we have a better explanation of what these roles are in middle class society for women. A woman, starting in the upper right hand corner, a woman is subservient to her husband. She is responsible on the upper left for the education of her children and especially the moral education of her children. A woman will read to her kids. She will instruct her children before they go to school. A woman is preschool in this century. She is not the entirety of education unless you live some completely socially isolated place. So while we see the woman teaching or reading to children, she is also probably reading a religious text to give them moral education. The woman is responsible for running the household. In the middle image, the wife is sitting on the left-hand side at one end of the table. Her husband is sitting at the other. They are surrounded by guests. They have a maidservant bringing food to the table, but the wife is responsible for bringing all of these elements together in running the household efficiently. So she's not just sitting there like a pet rock. She is managing the household intrinsically. She has a musical background, and in the lower right-hand corner, she is responsible for teaching her children the value of music and the arts. She plays the piano, and she has instructed her children how to play the piano and how to sing. Her husband goes to a different room after dinner. He doesn't interact with the family. He has a study. He goes and reads the newspapers or magazines to educate himself and to better understand the world around him. His children and his wife go somewhere else and leave him alone because he needs a shelter even from them. This is the world of the 19th century family. What if we question that? What if we question this separation of life all around us? Are women second-class citizens? Historically, we see that they are. Historically, we treat them as such. They have no property rights. When a woman lives in the household of her father, everything that she owns, including the clothes on her back, belong to her father. When she gets married, all of that property is transferred to her husband, and she has no personal property rights or ability to own property. If she earns money, that money technically belongs to her husband. She doesn't have the right to vote. She doesn't have the right to divorce a husband in the event of abuse or abandonment. Essentially, even though we have those images of the perfect middle class home, even the middle class and upper class wife is a servant to the men in her life. And so reform movements are centered on changing this second class status for women in society, to remove them from this state of perpetual servitude. And it has its roots even in other reform movements. Reform movements give women their first opportunity to be active in the public world because as reform movements are seen as an attempt to perfect society, if women are the only perfect beings in society, they must be active as reformers. So women earn their voice in society through the reform movements. The suffrage movement is actually an offshoot of the abolitionist movement, which we'll end the lecture talking about. The abolitionist movement is obviously the move to end slavery, and women will be very heavily active in the abolition movement, and eventually they'll start saying to themselves, I am working for the freedom and equality of people in society, and yet I myself am not equal. How is this right? Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, pictured here in 1848 with her two children, will be very active in the rise of both the abolition movement and the women's suffrage movement, as will Sojourner Truth, the African American woman pictured on the right here, on the far right. She is herself a former slave, although she's not a Southern slave. She is born and raised and lives in New York State, when New York had slavery. She actually, from accounts, spoke with a slight Dutch accent from the area that she lived in. So if you ever see somebody doing a first person impression saying that teaching about Sojourner Truth by dressing up as her and acting like Sojourner Truth, if she has a southern accent, she's doing a pretty crappy job of it. We also see people like Amelia Bloomer rise up. Hey, I've heard the term bloomer before. What is that? I vaguely have an idea what that is. This is a bloomer suit. As part of societal reforms, Amelia Bloomer, herself a suffragette and abolitionist, says that we need to reform how women are able to dress. That having to wear dresses on a daily basis is an imposition by a male society that is very uncomfortable and strict for women. You can't wear a dress that allows your ankle to show. You have to wear crinolines, multiple levels and layers of dresses. You have to wear big cage hoops, and it's very restrictive clothing. And Amelia Bloomer designs an outfit, a new style of dress for women that is reform in and of itself. This woman is wearing pants. This is a sinful, horrendous vision of womanhood in the 19th century. How dare you let us know that you have legs by the clothing that you wear? She's wearing a skirt, but it is not a restrictive skirt. It covers her dress. It goes with this idea of a woman wearing a dress, but essentially it's like wearing a robe. She's not wearing highly restrictive clothing. So these are all aspects of reform for women's life in the 19th century. Again, I've gone a little bit long. I love talking about reform movements. We'll finish this up in the third lecture, talking about not just women's rights, but suffrage and abolition and the backlash against them. Have a great day.